Two German aces line up the kill, their wingman closing the trap. Between them, a lone American pilot in a battered P-40 over the Mediterranean in March 1943 has no altitude, no speed, and no way out. He is about to do something the manuals never taught, something that will either save his life or prove the doctrine right, one last, fatal time. In the spring of 1943, the Mediterranean theater is a place that bleeds Allied pilots at a terrifying and unsustainable rate. The German Messerschmitts and the Italian Machi fighters dominate the skies over the rugged hills of North Africa and Sicily. Their pilots are seasoned veterans, men who have been blooded over the skies of France and the vast, frozen plains of Russia. They are masters of a new and deadly form of air combat, a philosophy of energy tactics and vertical fighting. They hunt in coordinated, disciplined pairs, exploiting their superior altitude and speed with a surgical and almost contemptuous precision. Into this meat grinder, the American pilots arrive in waves. Most of them are fresh from the stateside training programs of the rapidly expanding Army Air Corps. Their logbooks are thick with flight hours, but they are thin with the kind of hard-won wisdom that only comes from actual combat. They're flying the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a tough and rugged aircraft, but one that is fundamentally outclassed by its German counterparts in its rate of climb and its high-altitude performance ceiling. The math of this confrontation is brutal, and it is simple. In the first bloody months of the North African and Mediterranean operations, the Allied fighter losses are exceeding the rate of their replacements. The squadrons are cycling through their pilots the way an infantry company cycles through its riflemen. The smell inside the cockpit of a P-40 is a potent and unforgettable mixture of engine oil, hydraulic fluid, and human sweat. The hot Mediterranean sun turns the thin, metal shell of the aircraft into a suffocating oven. The pilots wear their thick leather jackets not for warmth, but to protect their skin from being burned when they accidentally touch the superheated frame of the cockpit. The control stick vibrates constantly in their hand, a direct physical connection to the roaring Allison engine that sits just 6 feet ahead of them, throwing its heat and its fumes back through the firewall. The visibility from the cockpit is notoriously poor. The long, heavy nose of the aircraft blocks the view forward and down, creating a massive blind spot. Combat becomes a frantic and often fatal scan of the sky, a constant craning of the neck, with eyes watering from the strain of the altitude and the glare of the sun. The tactical doctrine that these young men have been taught is clear, and it has been written in the blood of the pilots who have come before them. Maintain your altitude at all costs. Never, ever get into a turning fight with a more maneuverable enemy fighter. Use your superior dive, speed to disengage, and above all, fight in pairs, protect your wingman, and protect each other. These rules have been refined over 2 long and costly years of air combat in Europe, and they work, more or less. When the pilots follow them, their survival rates improve. When they deviate from them, when they give in to the instinct to turn and to fight, they die. But the doctrine assumes a rough parity between the opposing forces. It assumes that you can choose when and where to engage. Over the Mediterranean in early 1943, the Allied fighter pilots rarely have that luxury. They are flying defensive missions, escorting the slow, lumbering bombers, the cargo planes, the reconnaissance birds. They cannot run. They cannot choose the terms of the fight. When the German fighters bounce them from above, diving out of the sun, their only job is to absorb that first devastating attack and to try and survive long enough to scatter the enemy and to protect the bombers. Most of them do not. The vertical tactics of the Luftwaffe are devastating. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, diving from 20,000 feet, can build its speed to over 400 miles per hour. It can close to firing range in a matter of seconds. The P-40 pilot, his eyes straining to scan the empty sky, often sees the attacker far too late. The German cannon shells walk up the fuselage of his aircraft. Fire blooms from a ruptured fuel tank. The aircraft tumbles out of the sky, trailing a long black ribbon of smoke and pieces of its own shattered skin, and the sky moves on. Between the missions, the surviving pilots sit in the shade of their aircraft's wing roots and they talk in quiet, subdued voices. They compare their notes. They sketch diagrams of the engagements in the sand with a stick. They argue about deflection angles, about energy states, about the moments of sheer, blind luck that had allowed them to survive when their friends had not. All of them are exhausted, and all of them have seen their friends burn. The ground crews work through the night, patching the bullet holes, replacing the shattered canopies, and scrubbing the blood from the seats. They do not speak of what they clean. The mechanics, men who see the true cost of the war in the twisted metal and the failed engines, develop their own quiet superstitions. Some refuse to work on a plane that has already lost 2 pilots. Others inscribe small personal symbols on the engine cowlings, quiet prayers written in grease pencil. Everyone knows the statistics. Everyone pretends that they do not. In the officers' tents, the intelligence summaries tally the losses in neat, cold columns. The graphs show the kill ratios. The reports recommend a series of small tactical adjustments. The commanders send urgent cables back to headquarters, requesting better aircraft, more fuel, longer training cycles for the new pilots. The replies that come back are sympathetic, but they are vague. Everyone is short of everything. The war is a global conflict. The resources flow to the places where they are most needed. And in the grand strategic calculation of 1943, the Mediterranean is a secondary front. The pilots are told to make do, and so they do. And they die. And then, a quiet pilot from a small town in Texas, a man with a quiet drawl and a strange and persistent habit of sketching in notebooks, starts asking the questions that no one else has thought to ask. The man who begins to question the brutal mathematics of the air war is named Lance Wade. He is not the square-jawed, charismatic hero of the newsreels. He is an outsider, a man who sees the world not through the lens of instinct and aggression, but through the cool, clear glass of an engineer's eye. Born in a small Texas town, Wade was raised not on the stories of war heroes, but on the romantic tales of the barnstormers and the early airmail pilots. He had learned to fly in his teens, trading his labor for flying lessons at a dusty, rural airstrip outside of Broadus, Texas. He had no money. He had no connections, just a deep and obsessive fascination with the pure, beautiful mechanics of flight. He read everything he could find, dry, academic textbooks on the principles of aerodynamics, dense technical manuals on engine performance, and the popular magazine articles about the racing pilots of the 1930s and their constant, ingenious modifications. Wade was not a natural pilot, not one of the gifted few who seem to be born with a perfect, intuitive feel for the machine. He was methodical. He approached the act of flying the way a master machinist approaches a complex lathe, with an infinite patience and a deep respect for the precision of the craft. He did not trust his instincts. He trusted math. He kept a logbook, not just of his flight hours, but of the conditions of every single flight: the wind speed, the air temperature, the aircraft's weight, the fuel load. He would make meticulous notes on how each of these variables changed the performance of the aircraft. He was developing a deep and almost intimate sense for the very edges of an aircraft's performance envelope, for those dangerous and unforgiving margins where the pilot's control begins to soften and the pure, hard laws of physics take over. When the war broke out in Europe, Wade tried to enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps. He was rejected. His eyesight was poor. It was correctable with glasses, but the peacetime standards were incredibly strict. He tried again. He was rejected again. Frustrated, but not defeated, he heard about a British program that was actively recruiting American pilots. The Royal Air Force, having been bled white in the Battle of Britain, was desperate for trained aviators. Their standards were lower. Wade volunteered immediately. In the late months of 1940, he sailed for England, one of the dozens of quiet and often forgotten American heroes who would fly for the RAF before the United States had even officially entered the war. His training in England was abbreviated. The British needed pilots in the air, not in the classrooms. Wade was quickly assigned to a fighter squadron, then to another, and then, in early 1942, he was shipped to the brutal, unforgiving theater of North Africa. He flew the aging Hawker Hurricanes at first, and then he transitioned to the American-made P-40s as they began to arrive in the theater. His squadron mates were a motley and international mix of men: British, South African, Australian, Rhodesian, American. They called themselves the Desert Air Force. They were tired, they were understaffed, and they were almost constantly outnumbered by their German and Italian adversaries. Lance Wade did not stand out at first. He was quiet, he was polite, and he was completely unassuming. He did not boast or tell the usual exaggerated stories in the mess tent. After the missions, when the other pilots would gather to drink and to try and forget the horrors of the day, he would disappear to his own tent, and there he would write. Not letters home, but notes. He would sketch the geometry of the day's dogfights from his memory, drawing the complex, intersecting arcs and vectors of the aircraft, trying to estimate the speeds and the angles of the attacks. He was, in his own, quiet and academic way, trying to understand something that eluded most of the other pilots. He was trying to understand the pure, unadulterated physics of air combat. Most of the pilots thought in terms of maneuvers: a brake left, a split S, a chandelle. But Wade, the engineer, was thinking in terms of energy states. He was thinking about potential energy in the form of altitude and kinetic energy in the form of speed. He was thinking about the constant and often fatal conversion of altitude into speed and the high aerodynamic cost of turning, a cost that was always paid in the currency of velocity, bled away. He was beginning to see the patterns that the others, in their focus on the visceral thrill of the fight, had missed. He was beginning to realize that the established doctrine was not wrong, but that it was incomplete. It taught the pilots what to do, but it did not, and could not, explain why. It did not explain the underlying, brutal, and beautiful mechanics of the fight. The machinist of flight was about to go to work. Lance Wade began to experiment in the quiet laboratory of his own cockpit. He started with small, marginal things, adjustments that would be all but invisible to his squadron mates. He would adjust his throttle settings during a climb, patiently searching for the optimal rate that would give him the most altitude for the least amount of fuel burned. In the simulated dogfights of training flights, flying alone where a mistake would not cost a wingman his life, he would test how much he could tighten a turn before the aircraft's wings would begin to shudder, the telltale buffet that signals an impending stall. His ground crew began to notice the unusual wear on his aircraft. The tires were scuffed from the hard, last-minute landings. The paint was scraped from the wingtips from the stress of high-G maneuvers. The crew chief, a grizzled and experienced veteran, asked him if everything was all right. Wade, in his usual, quiet way, simply said that he was learning the airplane. The crew chief did not ask again. Wade's squadron leader was a by-the-book officer, a decorated veteran of the Battle of Britain. He valued, above all else, discipline and formation, integrity. He did not encourage freelancing. When Wade began asking his probing, technical questions during the pre-mission briefings, the squadron leader would answer them curtly. "Doctrine exists for a reason, Wade," he would say, his voice sharp with impatience. "Pilots who deviate from it die." The discussion, for him, would end there. But Wade could not stop thinking. He could not shake a growing and deeply heretical conviction that something fundamental was being missed. The P-40, he knew, was slower in a straight line than a Messerschmitt. It climbed worse. It could not outrun, and it could not outclimb, the enemy. The established doctrine, therefore, was to avoid a turning fight at all costs. But what if that was exactly and completely wrong? What if the one single place where the P-40 actually held a significant advantage was the very place that no one was looking? He knew the numbers. He had studied the performance charts until he had them memorized. A P-40 Warhawk, at certain speeds and at certain altitudes, could sustain a significantly tighter turning radius than a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It had a lower wing loading, which meant that its wings had more relative area to grip the air. And it had better, more forgiving, low-speed handling characteristics. In a flat, grinding horizontal turn, it might be able to outturn the German fighter. But the doctrine, the Bible of their survival, said to never, ever try. Turning bleeds off your speed. And a slow aircraft, in the brutal, vertical world of a dogfight, is a dead aircraft. Every single flight manual agreed. Every single instructor taught it, and every single bloody combat report from the front lines seemed to reinforce it. Lance Wade, the quiet man from Texas, the machinist of flight, began to wonder if everyone, the instructors, the commanders, the very authors of the doctrine itself, was wrong. The problem, of course, was not a new one. Since the earliest days of the war in 1940, the Allied pilots had been facing faster, better climbing German fighters. The British had solved this problem with their legendary Spitfire, an aircraft that could match the Messerschmitt in almost every aspect of its performance. But the P-40 did not have that option. It was an older, pre-war design, a machine that had been optimized for ground attack and for low-altitude work. Against the modern, high-performance German fighters, it was fundamentally overmatched, and the losses continued to mount. By the middle of 1943, some of the P-40 squadrons in the Mediterranean were reporting a 50% turnover in their pilots every 2 months. New pilots would arrive, they would fly a handful of missions, and then they would simply and quietly disappear. The veterans, the few who were left, grew hollow-eyed and distant. They stopped trying to learn the new pilots' names. They stopped attending the memorial services. There were simply too many of them, and through it all, the doctrine, the sacred and untouchable text, remained unchanged. Maintain your speed, avoid turning, disengage when possible. The rules were carved in stone because no one had yet found a better answer. No one had yet been able to prove an alternative. The cost of experimentation was death, and death was already far too common. But Lance Wade could not stop thinking about energy. He would lie awake in his tent at night, listening to the wind snap at the canvas, and he would run the complex, beautiful equations of flight in his head. He knew that a turn cost speed, but speed, he reasoned, could be regained. A tight turn imposes high G-forces, but the human body, for a short period, can endure those Gs. A slow aircraft is indeed vulnerable, but it is only vulnerable if the enemy can bring their guns to bear, and if your turning radius is tight enough, if you can get inside the enemy's own turn, then they cannot. He began to visualize a new maneuver. It formed slowly in his mind, over weeks of quiet thought and frantic late-night sketches. It was a hard, descending turn to be initiated at the very last possible second, at the moment of the enemy's attack. It was not a gentle, evasive break. It was not a standard defensive spiral. It was something far more violent. It was a full deflection pull on the control stick, a maneuver that would impose the maximum possible G-force on the airframe and on the pilot, a maneuver that would deliberately, and with a suicidal seeming intent, bleed off the aircraft's speed in order to tighten its turning radius. The goal was not to escape. The goal was to reverse the geometry of the fight. The goal was to turn so tightly, so violently, that you could get inside the attacker's own wider turning arc and to force the enemy to overshoot. It was the opposite of doctrine. It was, by any conventional measure, an act of suicide, unless, of course, it worked. Lance Wade had a theory, an equation sketched in a notebook, but he had no way to safely test it. A training flight could not simulate the terrifying, high-speed reality of a German Messerschmitt diving out of the sun at over 400 miles per hour. No friendly pilot would be willing to press a mock attack that close to replicate the split-second, life-or-death timing that the maneuver required. The only way for Wade to know if his insane idea would work was to try it in actual combat. And he knew with a cold and simple certainty that if he was wrong, he would not get a second chance. He thought about telling his squadron leader about trying to explain the complex physics of the maneuver, but he already knew the response he would get. Doctrine exists for a reason, Wade. Pilots who deviate die. He would be ordered to stop. He would likely be grounded for his own safety. And his idea, the potential solution that had been consuming him for months, would die with him. So he said nothing. He filed the maneuver away in the quiet laboratory of his own mind, a theoretical answer to an impossible and ever-present problem. He continued to fly the standard missions. He continued to follow the rules. He survived, and he waited for the moment when simply following the rules would not be enough. That moment arrived in March of 1943. Wade was flying an escort mission for a transport run over the Mediterranean. His flight consisted of 4 P-40s strung out in a loose defensive formation, their pilots scanning the vast, empty sky. The transport plane, a slow and lumbering C-47, lumbered along below them. The mission was routine. The radio chatter was sparse. Then the call came. "Bandits! High! 2 o'clock! Diving!" Wade looked up and saw them, 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s in a classic bounce attack, sunlight glinting off their canopies. They were fast. They were committed. And they had chosen Wade as their primary target. His wingman, following his training, broke hard to the left. The other 2 P-40s in the flight scattered, trying to draw off one of the attackers. Wade was now, for a few critical seconds, alone. The Messerschmitts split their formation, one high, one low, a classic vertical pincer attack. It was a textbook German tactic, and it was designed to be inescapable. Wade's hand tightened on the control stick. His mind went quiet. The fear was there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was distant. He was calculating. He was processing the variables: speed, angle, closure rate, time. The lead Messerschmitt attacked first, diving from above. Wade saw the bright, winking flashes of its cannons. The tracer rounds began to arc towards him, looking lazy and bright in the clear air. He had, he calculated, perhaps 2 seconds to live. His training, his doctrine, his every instinct screamed at him to do one thing: dive, to run, to use gravity to build his own speed and to try and escape. Every single fiber of his body wanted to push the stick forward and to flee. Instead, Lance Wade pulled back, hard. He brought the control stick all the way into his lap, a full deflection pull on the elevators. The nose of his P-40 pitched up violently. The horizon spun. The G-forces slammed him down into his seat, the blood draining from his head, his vision tunneling down to a small gray circle. The engine shrieked in protest, the wings flexed, groaning under the immense strain. The entire aircraft shuddered on the very edge of a catastrophic, high-speed stall, and the world rotated. The Messerschmitt, its pilot committed to his high-speed dive, flashed past, far too fast to compensate for Wade's sudden, violent change in direction. It could not possibly turn inside Wade's impossibly tight, G-strained arc. It overshot, its nose high, its own energy now bleeding away as the German pilot tried to reacquire his target. Wade rolled out of his turn, his own aircraft now slow and still vulnerable, but no longer in the line of fire. He had, in a single, desperate and brilliant move, reversed the attack. The hunter had become the hunted. The second Messerschmitt was still in its dive, its pilot now seeing his own wingman in a position of vulnerability. Wade, however, had no speed. He could not run, he could not climb, he had only one option. He pulled again. The same maneuver, the same violence. The aircraft bucked and groaned. The stall warning horn rattled in his ears, his vision grayed out, but he held the turn. The second Messerschmitt, just like the first, overshot. Wade rolled his wings level. Both of his attackers were now ahead of him, climbing, trying to regain their position and their energy advantage. Wade was slow. He was low, but he was alive. The Messerschmitts did not press the attack. They climbed away, unwilling to descend again into the same unpredictable and dangerous trap. Wade let them go. He had no fuel to pursue. He had no speed to catch them. He turned back toward the transport he was supposed to be protecting, his hands now trembling slightly on the stick, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just done something that, by all rights, should have killed him. And it had worked. The first defiance was complete. Lance Wade landed in silence. His ground crew inspected the aircraft and found no damage, not a single bullet hole. He climbed down from the cockpit, his legs unsteady. The crew chief asked him if he had seen any action. Wade just nodded. He did not elaborate. He walked to his tent. He sat on the edge of his cot, and he pulled out his notebook. He sketched the entire encounter from his memory, every angle, every second of the fight, and at the bottom of the page, he wrote a single word: repeatable. But his squadron leader did not see it that way. Wade filed his official combat report, a dry and factual account of the engagement. The leader read it. He frowned, and he called Wade into his tent. He asked Wade to explain the maneuver. Wade tried. He talked about the turning radius of the P-40, about the principles of energy exchange, about the geometry of the fight. The leader listened with a growing frustration. He told Wade that he had just gotten lucky. He told him that the maneuver was reckless, and he ordered him to never, ever try it again. "Doctrine exists for a reason, Wade," he said, his voice hard. "Pilots who deviate from it die." Wade said nothing. He saluted. He left the tent. He knew what he had experienced. He knew that it had not been luck, but he also knew with a quiet certainty that he could not convince anyone with just words. He needed more proof. He needed repetition. He needed other pilots to see it work. So he kept flying, and he kept waiting. A few weeks later, in April, another mission, another bounce. This time, Wade was ready. The moment the Messerschmitt committed to its dive, Wade pulled. The same violent turn, the same shuddering edge-of-stall arc, the same clean overshoot. And this time, Wade had enough speed remaining to reverse his own turn. He pulled up into a climbing turn, his own gun sight now tracking the Messerschmitt as it tried to escape. He fired a short, disciplined burst. The tracers converged on the German fighter's fuselage. It began to trail a thin line of black smoke. Wade did not follow it down. He turned back to his formation. Another encounter, another survival. In May, a third engagement. But this time, Wade's wingman saw the maneuver. After they landed, the young pilot, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief, asked Wade how he had done it. Wade explained, slowly and carefully. He drew the diagrams in the sand. He talked about the timing, about the precise moment to initiate the pull. The wingman listened. On their next mission, when they were attacked, the wingman tried it. He overshot his own first attempt, pulling too early, but he survived. On the next engagement, he got the timing right. He forced the German fighter to overshoot. He lived. The word began to spread. Other pilots started to ask questions. Wade began to hold informal, impromptu briefings, sketching on scraps of paper, demonstrating the complex, three-dimensional movements with his hands. Some of the pilots were skeptical, but others, the ones who were desperate enough, were willing to try anything. Gradually and quietly, the maneuver began to circulate through the squadron. It never had an official name. The pilots just called it Wade's turn, or sometimes the last-ditch break. A few with a gallows humor called it suicide with a chance. The squadron leader, of course, heard about it. He was furious. He called Wade into his tent again. He threatened to have him grounded, to have him court-martialed for deliberately teaching a non-regulation and dangerous maneuver. Wade listened calmly, and then he asked a simple and unanswerable question. "How many of your pilots have survived by using this maneuver, sir?" The squadron leader did not have an answer. Wade provided one for him. 7 pilots, sir, in 8 separate engagements, with no losses. The numbers spoke with a clarity and a force that the commander could not ignore. He dismissed Wade without any further comment, but he did not issue the grounding order. The unofficial and unapproved experiment was allowed to continue. In June of 1943, the new tactic faced its largest and most decisive test. A massive German fighter group, more than 20 Messerschmitts, bounced an entire Allied squadron of 12 P-40s. The radio erupted with the frantic, overlapping calls of pilots under attack. The sky filled with a chaotic web of tracers and black smoke. Wade, in the heart of the melee, pulled his maneuver twice, forcing 2 separate attackers to overshoot and staying alive in the swirling chaos. Around him, other American pilots were doing the same. The Luftwaffe pilots, who had grown accustomed to easy, high-speed kills, were suddenly faced with a sky full of targets that refused to cooperate. Their textbook attack runs, which should have been successful, were failing. The firing solutions that should have been simple were evaporating in an instant. Confusion and then frustration began to spread through the German formation. The engagement, which should have been a slaughter, lasted for a full 8 minutes. When it finally ended, 3 of the P-40s had been lost, but 9 of them, a full 75% of the squadron, had survived and were returning to base. In previous, similar-sized engagements, the loss rates had averaged 50%. The math was, once again, undeniable. Something had changed. The unofficial tactic had become an unofficial canon. The after-action reports from that large engagement in June finally reached the higher command. The intelligence officers, the men who looked at the war not as a series of individual dogfights, but as a set of cold, hard statistics, began to take notice. A flight instructor from the main training command was sent to Wade's squadron to personally interview him. The instructor, a veteran pilot himself, was, at first, deeply skeptical, but he listened, and then he asked Wade to demonstrate the maneuver. Wade took him up in a 2-seat trainer. At a safe altitude, he simulated the maneuver, slowly and with a controlled precision. The instructor experienced, firsthand, the crushing G-forces, the violent buffet of the impending stall, and the sheer, gut-wrenching violence of the pull. He landed, his face pale and quiet, and he filed a report that recommended a formal and immediate evaluation of the new tactic. A formal test program was initiated. Pilots volunteered to act as the attackers and the defenders. Wade, the quiet man from Texas, now found himself in the role of an instructor, teaching his own heretical maneuver in a series of structured sessions. The engineers measured the turning radius, the G-loads, the speed loss, and they confirmed what Wade, the machinist of flight, had intuited all along. At specific low speeds, the P-40 Warhawk could, in fact, outturn a Messerschmitt Bf-109 by a significant and life-saving margin. The cost was a massive loss of speed, but the gain, as the combat reports were now proving, was survival. The official doctrine was, at last, quietly updated. There was no public announcement, no grand reversal of the old rules. But the training syllabus for new pilots was modified. They were now taught the high-G defensive brake as a last resort, emergency tactic. The instructors began to emphasize the importance of timing, of energy states, and of a deep, intimate understanding of an aircraft's control at the very edge of a stall. The maneuver was not a replacement for sound, energy-based tactics. It was an additional tool, a final, desperate option in a fight that was about to be lost. By the summer of 1943, Wade's turn had spread far beyond his own squadron. Pilots across the entire Mediterranean theater were now using it. Some of them began to modify it, adding their own roles or vertical components. Others began to combine it with other tactics, using the initial defensive break to set up their own opportunistic counterattacks. The Luftwaffe began to adapt as well, their pilots becoming more cautious in their attacks, more wary of overshooting their targets. But that very caution slowed them down. It disrupted their aggression, and that, in itself, saved lives. Lance Wade's own personal tally of kills continued to grow. By August, he was credited with 8 confirmed victories, not through a newfound aggression, but through the simple act of survival, and by brilliantly turning a purely defensive maneuver into an offensive opportunity. He was promoted, he was given a flight of his own to command. He continued to fly, he continued to teach. He did not seek recognition, he only sought results. By the end of 1943, Wade had flown over 200 combat missions. He had 13 confirmed kills. He had never, in his entire combat career, lost a wingman. In January of 1944, he was transferred to a new squadron, one that was equipped with the powerful new P-37 Thunderbolt. The P-47 was a brute of a machine, a heavy fighter with an immense amount of power and armor. It did not need Wade's maneuver. It simply overpowered its opponents, but Wade continued to fly with the same methodical precision, the same deep physical understanding of his machine. But on a routine, non-combat flight, his aircraft suffered a catastrophic engine failure on takeoff. He crashed. He was killed instantly. He was just 28 years old. The news of his death spread quietly through the squadrons. The pilots who knew him attended a small service in a dusty field outside of Naples. There was no grand ceremony. A chaplain said a few words, a bugler played taps, and the war moved on. Lance Wade's name appeared on the long and ever-growing casualty lists, one more name among thousands. There was no posthumous medal, no official commendation, and no mention in the official histories of the maneuver that had saved dozens and perhaps hundreds of lives. But the maneuver itself survived. It became a part of the unofficial canon of American fighter tactics, a piece of hard-won wisdom that was passed down from pilot to pilot, from squadron to squadron. After the war, aviation historians would begin to document the many tactical innovations of the conflict. Wade's defensive break would be analyzed in the technical journals. Test pilots would recreate it in modern aircraft. It would become a classic case study in the art of energy management, a powerful lesson in how to fight from a position of profound disadvantage. In the 1950s, the maneuver would be formalized in the U.S. Air Force's own training, and it would be taught to a new generation of jet pilots who would be facing their own faster, missile-armed adversaries. The principles and the physics remain unchanged. Sacrifice your speed to tighten your turning radius. Force the overshoot. Reverse the geometry of the fight. The names of the pilots who would use this maneuver in the wars to come would be recorded. The name of the man who had first invented it in the desperate, lonely skies over the Mediterranean would be mostly forgotten. But his quiet, stubborn, and brilliant idea would live on, a legacy written not in stone, but in the pure and unforgiving physics of survival.